Играем так уж и... Хорошо, хорошо. Ты вообще ужасно играешь. Ну ничего, надо как-то двигаться постепенно, освоить программу вступления. Ну и все тогда. Ну, если нет, то нет, значит. Если все, и смирись тогда. Все тогда у тебя жизнь так никогда не будет такой. Значит, ты никогда не будешь пианистом, вот и все. Ну то есть не меняется. Ну, проживешь как-нибудь остаток дней, значит. С досадой и с тоской смирись и все. И семье отдавай себе какой-нибудь. Другу какой-нибудь. Добрый будь. Деньги же, благотворительностью заниматься. Бла-бла-бла. И прочим деятельством. Мало да большим. За других отвечай. Так можно так делать, да? Ну, подорожку. Вот так можно делать, да? Ну, видишь, будет чем-то на тебя заняться, скоротать свои дни до кончины твоей. Что тоже может еще и приблизиться. Интересно. Тогда же это может быть важно, да, наверное. Про удмуртов, по идее.
Welcome to this beginner jazz piano tutorial on the tune Georgia on My Mind. In this lesson we will learn how to arrange lead sheets using spread voicings. We will then introduce a stride style in our left hand, and towards the end of the tutorial we will touch upon some more advanced arranging techniques and principles. Georgia on My Mind is written in the key of F major, and so let's start with a quick recap of the diatonic seventh chords and also the common progressions in the key of F. All of the notation that I'm showing you can be found in the PDF workbook below this video. Let's start with the F major scale. And now let's build a diatonic seventh chord from each note of the scale. I'm going to play the seventh chord in my right hand and the root note in my left hand. So for the 1 chord, we have F major 7. For the 2 chord, we have G minor 7. The 3 chord is an A minor 7. The 4 chord, B flat major 7. The 5 chord is a C7. The 6 chord is a D minor 7, although as we'll see it's often played as a D7. The 7 chord is an E minor 7, flat 5, and then we're back to F major. The drills that I'm going to show you now will prepare you for playing Georgia on My Mind with two-handed spread voicings. The first step is to split the notes of the chord over two hands. So now we're going to play the root in our left.
Ничего не переделаешь. Ну, он понял, это... Ну, не знаю, что у меня. Ну, вообще не тренированное, можно сказать, просто оно не тренированное, типа того. Ну, потому что нету практики. Мало практики очень. Ну и как это? Ну и что делать теперь будешь? Ну, смирись, ну да не важно, блин. Это так, рассуждение. Мне что необходима программа. Или максимум.
Left hand, just the 3 and the 7 in our right hand. So the 1 chord, F major 7, the 2 chord, G minor 7, the 3, A minor 7, 4, B flat major 7, 5 is C7, 6 is D minor 7 or D7 as we'll see. The 7 is an E minor 7 flat 5, and then back to the roots we have a F major 7 chord. So the next step is to move the bass note down. So what's important is to be able to visualize these shapes, but with these notes spread out, particularly over 2 octaves. So now instead of playing this, we're going to play this. You can hear already we have a richer sound. So F major 7, the 1 chord, the 2 G minor 7, the 3 A minor 7, the 4 is B flat major 7, the 5 is C7.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about memorizing, specifically memorizing a long piece like a concerto. I don't know how relatable this is to some of you, but to me personally, memorizing is one of the scariest things as a musician that I could do. To me, the biggest part of performing is I'm so scared of memory slips. And so recently my teacher asked me to have this Wieniawski number 2, which I've been working on, to have it memorized. And that was honestly kind of terrifying to me because I haven't memorized a whole concerto ever in my life. I haven't even played with the piano accompanist in 2 years because of COVID. So this should be really interesting. But anyways, I thought I would make this video to kind of walk through my process as of right now for how I'm planning on tackling this piece. It is to memorize a whole 3-movement concerto. Granted, it's not as long as, say, like Sibelius or Tchaikovsky, but for me, it's still very long since I haven't memorized something in such a long time. For today's purposes, I'm just going to be working on movement 3, but the technique I'm using to memorize is going to apply to all sorts of other concertos, pieces, whatever. And then I kind of have 3 general tips for any sort of memorization, and just tips for good playing in general. So the first step I have in memorizing is to chunk down the piece. Let's see, for movement 3, this is what we have to work with. For movement 3, I think since it's a really fast movement, you might want to work in bigger chunks. But just to start, you want to make sure you go line by line, phrase by phrase, to know exactly what you're playing. Know it really well in your head. This is what I've been doing. This is a really, really small and tiny step. I mean, zooming in wise. But basically, I will look at, let's say, the first line, right? So if I were to play the first line, that's the first line, and that's it. So what you want to do is you want to have the music in front, and then know what the first line is in your head, turn the stand around, and then try to tackle it from there. Try to see if you can have that line memorized. Rests and everything, dynamics and everything, articulation. Try to have all those details in your photographic memory, basically, of what that line looks like. So basically, I will kind of go through this line by line, and then what I want to do is kind of put it into a chunk. It doesn't really matter how big the chunks are as long as you're comfortable with it, but eventually I think you want to start getting to the point where the chunks get bigger and bigger, and then you're eventually at landing points. So when you're memorizing, you get to specific landing points that remind you of where you are in the piece. So for example, I would probably do this part as a chunk. And then that would just be kind of like one little phrase, because then after that you get to specific landing points that remind you of where you are in the piece. So for example, I would probably do this part as a chunk. And then that would just be kind of like one little phrase, because then after that you have 3 bars of rest, and then you come back in for the cadenza. So that's kind of how I tackle it line by line, or I guess chunk by chunk. The next thing is, this was a really helpful tip that I received, is to memorize backwards. Now what I mean by memorizing backwards is you don't necessarily have to start at the very end of the movement. though eventually you will when you get to the end. But let's say like my goal for today is just to memorize the first page and a half. Then I'll start at the end of where I'm deciding to memorize from. In my case, let's see, on page 2, I'm gonna say I want to stop here at this phrase. I want to stop there, right? That's the last thing that I plan on memorizing. So I'm going to work backwards. So first I'm going to have that little line memorized, which I just did. But then I want to move back to where the phrase started before that. So for me, I'm going to move about 2 lines back where that phrase starts. Okay, so that was kind of messy because I still don't have this very well in my head. But the reasoning behind memorizing backwards is that we always start practicing from the beginning to the end. So what usually happens is that the end of the piece or the movement or whatever, those sections tend to get the least amount of attention. So usually we have the first bit of our piece memorized without even trying, because we always start there when we're going about our practice session or starting to practice for the day. But oftentimes, without even realizing, we spend a lot less time or we neglect the ending altogether. So in order to keep the ending on equal level, not even more, we have to intentionally spend more time on the ending parts, or the middle parts especially. Intentionally focusing on the ending sections of every piece will actually help you know the piece better overall. Honestly, this tip about memorizing from the end, working your way backwards to the beginning, is the best tip that I've personally received, since it really helps me get to know this piece and think of it in a way that I normally would not think of. View it from a different perspective. So basically, I'm breaking things down into chunks, into sections, and then I'm working my way backwards, back to the beginning. But the next most important thing, and basically the last step I'll take, is to focus on the transitions. The transitions between each chunk that you're playing. So let's say that the previous chunk I will be playing ends here. And then I'm back to where I was. So that's the beginning of one chunk and the end of another chunk. I want to practice those bits especially and practice playing them through. Since we split the piece into chunks and individual sections, we kind of stop thinking of it as a piece overall. So this is why the next biggest thing is to focus on those transitions, to bring it back together as a whole piece. So instead of thinking of chunks from like A to B, section A to B, B to C, we kind of lose the concept and lose the flow of the piece. So that's why we want to focus and practice those specific transitions, and then what you do is you play through 2 chunks at a time. So for me, this chunk that I'll be working on, sorry, that was really rough, but anyways, the point is, I am now bridging those 2 back together and almost creating a bigger chunk. But this is how you want to work. You want to work backwards, and you want to sew together more pieces like a quilt. Now that we've gone through the basic steps, you can see here, as I messed up, I didn't look back onto the music. I tried to remember in my head what I'm supposed to do at that moment. Where was I? Where did I get lost? And then try to get back on track yourself. And then, unlike what I just did, I moved on because I'm filming a video, but you want to go back and you want to make sure where you just messed up, you fix that, it's solid, because you don't want that little part to become murky in your brain again. You want to make sure you know exactly where you went wrong and what you did, and correct what your memory has of that moment. So for example, I'm just going to start playing from the top of the page, because I'm bound to mess up somewhere, and we'll talk from there. Notice how I went back? That little measure that I messed up, I just replayed it over and over so that my hands remember what I did wrong and my mind knows and remember what I did wrong. Memory is really tricky because it's a combination of muscle memory, which you're not really controlling, and then your mind memory. And so, like, your mind should know everything, which leads to your muscle memory. But then if you build that muscle memory wrong, it can be really hard to correct. In summary of what I've been doing, I've been chunking a piece, working backwards, and piecing things back together. Like I'm making a quilt, I'm sewing each little square, a little patch back together, and creating one big blanket. And then always remembering that if I can avoid looking at the music, I will do that. But obviously, if I forget, I will look at the music, study it, make sure I know it in my head once again, and then re-attempt the section and try to correct what I did wrong. Now, just a few things that are general tips for playing. Number one, knowing the piano accompaniment or the orchestra accompaniment is really important so that you know what to be listening for when you do match up with the pianist. Knowing the score so that you know how your part lines up. So this is mostly just general playing things, but it really contributes to memory because when you're hearing the accompaniment in the background, sometimes that can trigger where you're supposed to be if you get lost. And so knowing the accompaniment, especially what happens in those rests, especially what's happening when you have a bunch of notes together and you could possibly get lost, hearing that grounded, steady melody in the background if you're just playing notes, that really helps you remember where you are. Another thing I find really important is to kind of know the overall structure of what you're playing. So violin is a lot of patterns, right? Violin playing, music in general is a lot of patterns, a lot of scales. So if you're able to isolate things, that helps you remember things in a group better. So sequences like this, so if I were to condense this part, it would be those are the notes that I'm listening out for. So things like that, where you notice the sequences, the patterns, so you're breaking it down once more and seeing the bigger picture as opposed to all those little notes, those little embellishments in between. You really just need to know the main notes and what's going on. So those are basically most of the memorization tips that I know at least, and the ones that I'm using just to help me the most. I would love to know, I know that there's so many techniques and tips out there, I would love to know your thoughts. So please do leave a comment down below. I will definitely read all of them. And I really hope that you guys learned something new. If not, it reiterated some specific points for you guys. Happy memorizing, happy practicing. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.
Ну и чё, посижу 5 лет, значит, здесь. Да какая разница? Ну не здесь, да. В другую квартиру следует.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about tone builders. Three super simple, super quick exercises to build your violin tone.
Это расслабляет. Вот это вот ты меня понял. Вот это и есть это западня, самое главное. Все. Да. Это тебя и погубит, да.